Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the Savoy for having us. The Westerly Memoir Project is now in its 4th year, and we offer memoir classes in the spring and summertime at the Wise space at 91 High Street. We started off in the Westerly Public Library and have kind of moved to a space that offers registration and a whole bunch of services for us. I want to thank Ethan Gilsdorf, who's been the teacher for the last 4 years and has a very loyal following of students in Westerly, and has really, the excellence he brings to the teaching has really made the program what it is. And I think a testament is that students sign up session after session to continue to work and study with him. Ethan is actually a teacher I met at Grub Street in Boston, so he's in high demand in Boston and Providence as well. So his other commitments mean that he isn't able to do, he wasn't able to continue into August and September. And so I just want everyone to know September 9th and 16th, there will be community classes offered at the Y, and I will be leading those classes. I am a novelist, although I also am pretty well trained in the art of memoir myself. So if people want to come to that to finish up whatever project you might be working on, or just kind of continue with what you're doing, that would be great. And in addition, we're going to pass around a sign-up sheet for anyone who just might be interested in more information on the writing classes. They'll be starting up again in earnest in the spring and next summer as well. So to all the readers tonight and the students, I just want to thank you so much for being willing to share your work. So much of this project is about making meaning of our lives through writing, but also the project's really about making connections through writing. I really believe that in these classes we've made lots of friendships. We've improved our writing, but we've made lots of friendships and gotten to know other people in the community, and maybe built some bridges and friendships that you wouldn't have thought you'd have otherwise. So that was really part of the objective of starting the Memoir Project 4 years ago, and it really warms my heart to see this room so full and to have 10 people who are excited to read tonight, and then 11, if you count our headliner, Lang Martin, whose memoir, Permission to Fly, just came out earlier this spring. So everybody in here is a success in just getting your story on paper. And to share it is kind of the next step of kind of courage, and it's really a gift you're giving us all. So I'm not going to go on any further, but thank you, Ethan, for getting 10 people to the point of really wanting to share. We are taping this evening with no real mission other than I just don't want to lose it. We had a reading in November and it wasn't recorded at all, and afterwards I was kicking myself. So this will all be videotaped, and sometime in the future we may use it for something, but I would obviously get everybody's permission if we were going to do something like that. But it's just being kind of recorded for posterity right now. So if I could just ask the readers to make sure they speak into the microphone, and I'll turn it over to Ethan.
As Jeannie said, my name's Ethan Gilsdorf. I've been leading the Memoir Project. I forgot that it was 4 years already. And I would pretty much echo everything that she said, that it takes, it's been wonderful that the community's had such a good turnout for these classes. And there seems to be a real hunger and desire for people telling true stories about themselves and about their experiences. It's not happening not only on planet Earth and in the United States, but in Rhode Island and in this community. And obviously it's fulfilling some need we have to get together in a room and write our stories and talk about our stories and share them with each other. In the classes, we offer feedback. I offer some lessons and exemplary texts, and then really the hard work and the heavy lifting is done by all the students. and they are, strong and brave and vulnerable and willing to tell stories about their lives. And we talk about them as a group in the classes and offer suggestions. And I try to guide people through some kind of process so they feel like they have some ideas for how to improve the piece and hopefully a better handle on the craft of writing. For those of you who might be interested in taking a class in the future, and as Jeannie mentioned, there's a sign-up sheet going around to get on the mailing list so we can let you know when the next sessions are and so forth. The writing is a craft. It can be learned, just like building a birdhouse or installing help me out here. A chandelier, exactly, right? Or building a pizza oven in your backyard like I'm trying to do. These are things that you can practice, and these are things that you can learn. And I think in the community of other writers, other like-minded writers who are maybe equally enthusiastic, but also maybe a little bit cautious, or just not sure how it's gonna work out for them. There's strength in numbers, and I see it again and again. People around the seminar table get inspired by what other people are writing. Just a couple things. One is that and I'm neglecting to get your name, sir, behind the camera. Chris mentioned not only is it important for the readers who come up here to make sure that you speak into the microphone, either this one, well, ideally this one for this room, and this is his microphone, but don't wander too far to the side because you'll be outside of the range of the camera, so try not to be a wanderer. The other thing I would say, I would be remiss in not thanking a couple people. Number one is Jeannie herself, Jeanne Blasberg, who was just up here speaking. She is the brainchild and the founder of these classes, and she was very modest in not mentioning that she also is a published writer in her second book, the one that she's on tour right now, celebrating and getting out there on the planet, is called The Nine. And she just had her book launch at the Ocean House last week, and there's been some other events locally. It's for sale right here. Be sure to pick that up. And then our last reader tonight, Lang Martins, his book is also available for sale here. The bookstore is making this space available to us. We ourselves don't have a whole lot to sell because most of us are beginning writers, but I really hope you'll support the bookstore by buying something tonight, or buying a cup of coffee or a brownie or whatever they have over there. What else can I tell you before we begin? I think that's it. Oh, the Y, of course. We need to thank the local branch of your local Y here who've been really, really wonderful, particularly Sarah and Colin, who've been great about making sure, this gentleman right here is Colin, who just raised his hand, who's been great about helping to get the word out and making sure that the community members are aware of this wonderful program that's benefited so many people. So I think that's all I need to say as a way of starting, other than just, thank you for showing support for your family members and friends and community members. As Jeannie mentioned, we have 10 readers tonight. Each reader is going to come up here and read a short excerpt. It's either going to be an excerpt from a longer piece that they might have worked on in our classes, or it might be a complete piece that has a beginning, middle, and end. And I just asked each reader to kind of provide a little bit of context, because in some cases they may leave you at some incredible cliffhanger, and you may be wanting to know how the story ends. But we're trying to keep each reading to close to 5 minutes, just in the interest of time and keeping the whole event, on a reasonable schedule. Just as a reminder to the readers to just speak slowly and carefully, and if you have a little bit of butterflies in your stomach, harness that energy, but don't race through your pieces. Give it the breath and the sort of space that it deserves. And I'll just briefly just mention each writer before they come up. I think they all know their numbers. So our first reader is Rick Booth. Please welcome Rick Booth.
Comment ça va? My name is Rick Booth. I grew up in Avondale, back when real people lived there, with kids, and back when you couldn't be arrested for beating them up, your kids, that is, or the neighbor's kid. And I'm a Boilermaker's boy, which makes me pretty different from your average Ivy Leaguer. I did 15 years at the Westerly Sun, where I got a real view of the town of Westerly. Back then, it was quite the deal, and there were the old hardliners, Abe Solovicic and Don Lewis and Bill Cawley and some other people that taught me pretty well. Taught me the fundamentals, I can tell you. The last thing I'll say is that I actually wrote a book. It's called Hoda and Jake. It's on Amazon, and you can buy it if you want to. And if you don't, heck with you. This is a short piece on a very complicated man. An old expression says, you don't always get what you want, but you often get what you need. Growing up with my late father, Robert Booth, was so. It wasn't always fun, but it was always interesting. And looking back, I always got what I needed. He had his faults, did Robert, and everybody called him Robert, at least at work. He was a construction boilermaker, a giant with deceptive feline quickness. More than once, and more than twice, I learned as a small boy to respect that size, that quickness. And he was no fool. I didn't really learn that until I was 20, and I worked with him. At the time, Robert was at Millstone Point on the crew making No. 2 nuclear power station in Waterford, Connecticut. At home, he was a domestic nightmare. Often filthy thanks to work, although he took pains to wash. He drank some. And then he drank some more. The fact is, he wasn't at home. He was at home at work. He was a working man, and that's what I remember the most. It was a different time. He often terrorized me, though we enjoyed many times together in the family boat, at the beach, or hunting shellfish at the sandy bottom of the mouth of the Pawcatuck. Robert knew many things, but I never knew how he knew them. He just did. It took me many years to piece together the seemingly divergent men. The wise one who knew so much, and the quick-handed one who made me mind. Millstone, in my 20th year, forged all the pieces. Boilermaking, the construction and repair of plants that make electric power, is highly technical. It's dirty, and it's dangerous. It requires now immense physical strength, and then both wisdom and ability, working often on high steel. Amid countless dangers, my father's eyes never rested. They saw everything. And as he was by then one of the oldest Boilermakers, and the smartest they ever knew, the others knew he saw too. Thus, while he was not a foreman, they deferred to him. It was never Bob. Always Robert. Always. Now, my father died years ago, sapped by age and strokes. But I remember those eyes. And I will never forget the man who commanded so much respect at work, whatever his faults at home.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for getting us started off on a wonderful note. Next reader is Mike Ryan.
Jeannie, thank you so much for putting this project together. It's been great for me, and Ethan, thanks for the excellent and patient instruction, and thanks to the Savoy for hosting and the YMCA for the use of their space. I'm interested in undertaking or exploring how ego uses fear and anxiety to control so much of our lives, and how we can help one another sort of overcome that and deal with that. So the title of this piece is Tomorrow Will Worry About Itself. I was always happy to see Irene behind the cash register because she would let me sit on the floor and read comic books for as long as I wanted. Her brother Frank owned Allen's Candy News, and he was a good guy too, but he could be moody, and sometimes if I lingered too long, bent a comic book cover, or edged too close to the Playboy magazines, he would growl at me saying, "Buy something or go home." Irene was kind and patient with a fair but plain face. She had an inexperienced sense of fashion. She would take one element from all the best looks of the period and mix and match them in odd pairings. Her hair was cut short like Jackie Kennedy's, but bleached a Marilyn Monroe blonde. Her short-waisted dresses had the right cut, but instead of the cool pastel colors of the period, she mimicked some camouflage with dark browns and dull greens. Her instincts were good, but she needed someone older and wiser to coach her to a polished finish. It was summer 1964, and I had just finished 6th grade at State Street Elementary School. Looking at photos from that time, I see that my nose was too big for my face. I'd lost the cuteness of a child, but had not yet found any adolescent authority in my looks. In September, I would be attending the Babcock Junior High School. There, I would be expected to use a locker, find my way about the building, and fend off 9th grade bullies. Older friends told me stories about attending weekend parties where boys and girls spin the bottle and made out with each other. I'd never held a girl's hand, never mind kissed one, and I think this notion may have scared me more than dealing with older, bigger bullies. Burying my too big nose in comic books was one way I avoided dealing with the anxiety I felt. If I went to the store around 10 a.m., Irene would often send me to the Main Street diner down the street to fetch her a coffee. Sometimes I'd buy a Coke with the nickel she'd give me as a tip, and we'd talk as we sipped our drinks. "Are you going to work here for the rest of your life?" I asked one morning. "Maybe, I'm not really sure," she replied. "Won't you get bored here?" It's with some shame that I now consider the rudeness and thoughtlessness of that question. Irene's choices may have been limited by circumstances, and the options available to her at that time may have been few. I marvel at the kind tolerance she had for the 12-year-old knuckle-headed version of myself. She told me that, for now, she enjoyed working for her brother, and as for the future, I'll just see what happens, she said with a small smile. Had Irene graduated from high school? Had she been given the opportunity to go to college? Had her parents encouraged her to further her education? I never asked, so I don't know. At the time, I just assumed we all had the same opportunities, so I wondered why anyone would work as a clerk in a store as a career. I finished my Coke, slurping the last few drops through the straw, and I started to move back to the comics. But even Irene's patience had some limits. I realize only now that when she asked me, "What are you doing today?" she meant it as a hint that it was time to return the Coke for the 1-cent deposit and go home. "I think my mom is borrowing the Martin station wagon and taking us all to the beach. Are you working all day?" "I'll go to the movies later with a girlfriend." "Do you have a boyfriend?" "No." "Why not?" At 12 years of age, I may not have recognized my own impertinence, but I understood the small shrug of Irene's shoulders and the tight smile on her face. I tried valiantly to save her from her own thoughts, or maybe I was looking for some advice when I offered, "I never know what to say to girls. I get all nervous." Irene smiled and suggested gently that maybe I could just ask questions like, "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" or "Do you have a favorite pet?" She said that men talk too much about themselves and don't listen to women. Just be yourself and try to learn something about her. At that moment, I moved to make room for a businessman who approached the counter to pay for his newspaper. He was tall and he was wearing a suit and a tie. There was a smile in his voice as he handed her a quarter and said, "Good morning, Irene. How are you today?" I was surprised to see Irene's face turn a bright pink, and she looked down, studying the change she handed back. The man turned to leave and gave me a small shrug when he caught my eye as he left. I followed the man out. Irene was busy tidying the counter when I left. I was feeling a bit awkward, and neither of us said goodbye. Later at the beach, I was leaving the arcade after playing pinball. I saw Dory, the cutest girl in the 6th grade. She was kneeling in the sand making a castle. She didn't see me, and my first instinct was to walk by unnoticed. Instead, I marched up to her and, standing a bit too close and in a loud voice that startled her, asked, "Do you have a favorite pet?" Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Our next reader is Laurie Smith.
Hi, my name is Laurie. Thank you, first of all, for everybody that was involved in pulling off the Memoir Project class. I took it just a few weeks ago, this past August, and I really appreciated it. And this is my first foray into writing anything other than just what's in my journal. And I'm trying to work on ideas surrounding grit and determination. As I sat in church daydreaming one sunny Sunday morning, an usher approached me and said I had to leave. There was an emergency with my sister, and I needed to go to Boston immediately. Many months had passed with her in the hospital after the diagnosis of myositis, a rare muscle disease. She had now been admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit for an infection. A friend of the family drove me up to join my mom. We journeyed north and rode in silence as I gazed out at the sparkling summer day, wondering what to expect. Upon arrival, I was whisked to the PICU and told to scrub in. I scoured every inch of my hands and arms with the pungent antibacterial soap as I listened to the doctor and nurses talk in hushed tones to my mom. How old is she? They asked. 17, she replied. Silence. Visitors under the age of 18 were not allowed. There was some whispered discussion and an exchange of looks. More silence. Suddenly, a nurse handed me the yellow scrubs, complete with hat, mask, and booties, directing me to put them on quickly. This is when I knew things were serious. They were letting me in, although I was underage. They were letting me in to say goodbye. Miriam and I were always close, often inseparable, earning us nicknames that suggested we would end up spinsters that couldn't leave each other's sides. Like most kids of the 80s, our childhood was a feral one. The hours we attended school were balanced with time spent outdoors, running amok through the neighborhood with our friends. As soon as the dismissal bell rang, we dashed home for a quick snack, did our homework, and then ran back outside to meet up with everyone else on Asylum Road. Time was filled with bike riding, roller skating, catching frogs in the nearby stream, and games of manhunt that went well into the evening, as our moms poked their heads out the door to call our names for baths, followed by bedtime. Though 2 years younger than me, my sister was always by my side, as we hatched plans and caused trouble, leaving my mother to sigh at times, "Can't you two just fight with each other like normal siblings?" As I inched my way forward, I slowly opened the door to her hospital room. In contrast to the brightness of outdoors, this place was ice cold and as dark as a cave. The only light came from the glow of machines keeping my sister alive. The only sound, the incessant beeping. The air smelled oddly like mint toothpaste. There lay my sister, my best friend, in bed, a once athletic 15-year-old, now seemingly shrunken down to toddler size. Her wide brown eyes peeked out from behind the blankets when she spoke. "Do you want to play Uno?" her tiny voice squeaked. I nodded and started shuffling the cards. "Don't be scared," she said. "Dad came to me earlier and sat on my bed. He told me it wasn't time to go." This scared me more, as we had lost our father only 4 days before. "I know people won't believe me, but I saw him. He was here." Taking a deep breath, I dealt our hands as we swapped stories about friends and family members. Is Kevin out to sea? Did Melissa get a new haircut? Is Ray still singing U2 at the top of his lungs? Every question she asked was full of struggle. Struggle to breathe, struggle to speak, but full of hope. For that small moment in time, we were two average teenage girls chatting about life as we threw the draw 4 cards down in triumph. But nothing about our lives was average up to and including this point. Living with a diabetic father made that a certainty. Sprinkled in between the days of school and our free-range childhood was a pending sense of doom. While other girls attended father-daughter dances, we were monitoring his blood sugar levels, always with the orange juice at the ready for sudden dips. An average trip to our grandparents' house generally involved some disagreement. Is it my turn to hold the IV bag? No, you did it yesterday. Since he was still on the transplant list, Dad now needed 2 dialysis treatments per day. Never being one to just sit around and wait for the treatment to finish, he sometimes decided to take it on the road. Miriam and I took turns holding the IV bag, hanging it high out the car window as we traveled with Mom and Dad across town to visit our grandma and grandpa. I often wondered what other people thought they were seeing as they rode by. While our days were occupied with holding tight to the window IV, our evenings involved stories on the couch. Miriam and I would snuggle with Dad while we looked up at the painting of the cabin in the snowy woods and listened as he spun elaborate yarns about being lost in the forest. Other nights we would be treated to songs of shipwrecks or pirates as we sat around the wood-burning stove and he strummed his guitar after a rousing game of Uno. Mom would be in the kitchen doing dishes and peeking in occasionally to giggle. There were times with no stories or songs or games, only a quiet kiss goodnight. This was when we knew my father was losing strength. No, nothing about this childhood was average, especially not that rainy day at summer camp when we got the call to the office for a visitor. "Hi, Mom. Where's Dad?" I asked. I peered around the corner to see our pastor and his wife sitting on the couch in the camp director's cabin, looking pale and tired. Wait a minute. Why are they here? Laurie, Miriam, sit down, she replied. The room suddenly felt very stuffy, like the walls were closing in, as I took a seat. Daddy died yesterday. All the air left my lungs at that moment as my 13-year-old self was suddenly thrown into a whirlwind of saying goodbye to camp friends and making the long trek back to Rhode Island. Days later, we found ourselves silently riding in the back of a gleaming limousine devoid of tinted windows. The stifling August sun beat down on my forehead as I pressed it against the glass. Driving along, we passed children playing in the street. They watched as the limo moved at a snail's pace down the road, staring into the windows at my grief-stricken face. Possibly we looked important, but there is nothing I wanted more at that moment than to exit the air-conditioned limo's funeral procession and join those children playing outside on the burning sidewalk. Now, as I sorted my cards, I looked at my sister. She was tired and small and frail. Weakness took over after every turn of the card, but we played until she quietly whispered, "Uno," with all her strength, beating me, as always. Moments later, a knock came on the door. It was the nurse telling me it was time to go. I tried not to cry as I gave Miriam a hug and casually tossed out a "see you tomorrow." I walked out of the gloomy hospital room and into the sunshine, knowing this was possibly our last game of Uno together. Tomorrow came. So did lots of other tomorrows. My sister did not die, but sometimes I think I did a little bit. There's a strange burden that comes with being the healthy one, and a certain guilt nagging that I was getting off too easily. Those were scary times. Little did we know there were lots more to come. Sometimes when I hear someone complain, I jokingly ask, "But did you die?" I laughingly claim that I set the bar really low. Death. Are we still alive at the end of the day? If so, we have tomorrow and it's going to be all right. Now, who wants to play Uno?
Thank you, Laurie. Next reader is Al Clements.
Well, my name is Al Clements, and I've taken Ethan's course twice, and I enjoy the interaction with other writers that it provides. While the stories we share, and some of my classmates are here tonight, in our eyes are imperfect, they are, in my opinion, a perfect example of the tradition of storytelling that is embedded in the history of all languages. With that in mind, I'd like to share with you a very brief essay that I kind of played around with during the class. I call it Ancient Quests. Migration has been a part of the history of mankind since men first walked out of Africa in search of resources to sustain their families. When the world was an empty place, these migratory quests were honored as explorations. Those who led the way were praised as heroes. Even today, we honor their memories and speak of them with reverence. When we imagine the nearby planets and dream of the places yet to be discovered, do we still think of those who will lead the way as heroes, or are they now thought of as migrants who will spread evil and disease throughout the universe? Will the revered explorers who find pathways to the future become reviled for spreading disease with each footstep? When did exploration become migration and migration become immigration? The population of the Earth is now approaching 8 billion. It's unclear how many of us can be sustained by the remaining resources. Are we destined to return to a system of feudalism where large bands of armed men and women compete violently for what resources remain? A brief trip aboard the International Space Station would inform us that the areas of the Earth that can sustain us comfortably are already filled with people. Migration no longer occurs into empty lands. Migration has become immigration. The search for and control of remaining resources is no longer a friendly competition. If we should, by chance, find ourselves in the shoes of those who humbly stand before beautiful walls built by those who feared the loss of something that was beyond their understanding, could we convince those on the other side that they need not fear us? Could we convince them that we also were victims of an ancient strategy that had been instinctively practiced, but which was no longer valid? How could we convince those who block our path that their wall is also an ancient strategy that is no longer valid? The political screed that passes for reason is flawed. What moral matrix will be postulated to justify actions that reason cannot defend? Now, as I stand alone on a clear, cold night, stars seem to surround me like snowflakes in a late winter squall. The night belongs to me, yet I cannot protect it from the dawn. What will protect us from the battles that are sure to come? What could replace the sparkle that now fills the night? Will there still be fine to find our way when we no longer see the nearest shore? Excuse me. When mankind has become a creature who wanders through tunnels carved in the black remains of species long extinct, how much would we pay then for starlight at the end of day? Thanks.
Thank you.
Quick adjustment.
Yeah, sure.
We'll push that right there.
Yeah, people should not feel shy about speaking right into the microphone. Thank you, Al. Our next reader is George Rose.
Good evening, everyone. My name is George Rose, and this is my first effort at writing just about anything of any literary nature. But thank you to Ethan and the Memoir Project. It's really been a lot of fun and got to meet some very nice people. This is a story about my first unsupervised trip to New York City with two adolescent friends in 1968. It's an excerpt from a longer version. We arrived at Grand Central Station and immediately headed uptown, directly opposite to where we needed to buy our tickets at the newly located 33rd Street Madison Square Garden. According to Tommy, who emerged as the one clearly in charge, he needed to meet his uncle at his agent's office located just past Times Square. Tommy's uncle, according to his brief description, was a master of ceremonies, pool shark, and dancer. He would often take Tommy to pool halls where he would perform an act that included him dancing to both tap and ballet while completing challenging trick shots around a pool table. Before meeting Uncle Cosmo and his agent, Phil, given we had some time to kill, we were intercepted by a seedy, noisy, and definitely dangerous Times Square, riddled with questionable characters, 25-cent peep shows, and dancing go-go girls in public viewing windows for all passers-by to see. Being at the height of adolescence, my hormones and my guilty Catholic conscience were colliding at breakneck speed. Given the intensity and very surprising twist to our trip, we moved around aggressively, exploring all that was overwhelmingly presented. I remember Tommy and then Joe alternating attempts to get us admitted to one of these refined establishments, stymied by the one rule of needing to be 18 years old, ignored criterion that never stopped us from asking everywhere we went. As we peeked in the windows, we'd shout to each other, "Look at the one on the red. I know she's looking at me. Can you believe this?" We explored just about everything for about 2 hours in absolute sensory overdrive. At this point, my trip felt like a sharp impression of both heaven and hell. I was running with Ratso Rizzo in Midnight Cowboy, complete with a feeling of the imminent and very real danger of Times Square. Meanwhile, my mother had been left behind with the idyllic impression my trip was scheduled to be a wholesome, uplifting experience to view the new Madison Square Garden with friends while enthusiastically watching basketball, a sport she knew I truly loved. And that's where I found myself. Luckily, we were finally spared further distraction. It was now time to meet Tommy's uncle. Uncle Cosmo's agent, Phil, had an office in the Brill Building, located at 1619 Broadway, near 49th Street, which was once home to the most famous ensemble of songwriting talent ever assembled in one building. It was where Carole King, Bobby Darin, and even Paul Simon, along with countless others, honed their craft in the 1950s and 60s. His large office door was dark brown oak with smoked glass window. We were greeted by Marie, Phil's cigarette-smoking, gum-chewing secretary, who sat squeezed in between large stacks of papers strewn just about everywhere. Numerous scantily clad, quote, nightclub dancer photographs encompassed the front office walls, including separate photos of Uncle Cosmo with Peter Falk, Tony Bennett, and Dean Martin. We were told to wait until Phil and Uncle Cosmo were off the phone. "Sit yourselves down over here and make yourselves comfortable. They are on the phone and they're going to be a little while. Your first time in New York?" Jesus, I thought. Despite how fascinating it was, we are never getting out of here. Times Square was neon lights, full of life and exciting. That is, if you look past the squalor, the danger, and the hustlers. Sitting impatiently with Marie snapping gum and smoking Virginia Slims as we sat for over an hour until they were free was tedious at best. My hope of making it before game time had evaporated. We were already late. Uncle Cosmo was a very dynamic man. He measured about 5'5" tall, wore stylish eyeglasses, smoked a cigar, wore bow ties, and was a genuine New York City master of ceremonies showman. He possessed an electric personality and yet seemed very generous and gracious with his nephew Tommy. He smiled when he heard us describe our first experience with Times Square, but wisely warned that one trip was enough and to head to the game. "You young boys be careful out there," and encouraged us to be mindful of the temptations. Tommy sat behind closed doors with him and his agent Phil as Joe and I waited outside with Marie, staring at the ceiling. After what seemed like an eternity, and with a few sage words from Phil, modified by Uncle Cosmo's wisecracking comments to us about the trouble we were about to get into, Tommy seemed encouraged about his future. After what seemed like an eternity, we were off to the game, finally headed downtown. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Our next reader is Mirren O'Callaghan.
Thank you. This was written in Ethan's class this summer, and it's part of a larger work I'm exploring on home-based learning and education with my family. At age 17, it wasn't just my daughter Fiona's first time away from home alone. It was her first time at school. It wasn't just her first time living with roommates. It was her first time socializing with people her age all day, every day. As her primary teacher throughout her education, I had assessed that she had good reciprocal friendships. But as her mother, I had no idea if she would click with others when living with them, or if she'd tolerate the structure of daily classwork from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. at RISD's 6-week summer pre-college program. But then again, this was a place she felt comfortable doing what she was passionate about. And in that environment, she wouldn't need me. Around her 4-week mark at art school, I realized how disposable home life is for teens. I climbed the spiral staircase to her attic bedroom as I did each day since she was away to open or shut the windows or water her plants, and I found myself in the middle of a quiet place. It smelled of a hot summertime attic, not of body odor or nail polish. I could see the paint-splashed wooden floor now that her clothes and drawings and art supplies were stored in their proper places instead of scattered over the floor. She had caulked the grooves between each floorboard when transforming the space into her bedroom. It didn't matter that we bought out every tube of brown caulk in the hardware store, nor did it matter that it was a tedious job. By doing it, she was able to save the floor. It was a beautiful space now with big windows at both ends, hand-painted murals on the walls, artwork in her ceramic jewelry holders, and vintage Polaroid-style photos placed deliberately. Woven fabrics, fashion books, thrift store finds made a cohesive aesthetic style. I had known all of the belongings in her old pink bedroom downstairs, but up here, something had been happening without me. This was her world, and hers alone. And now I understood. It was a jumping ground for leaving home. I remembered that day 2 years ago when Fiona asked Tom and me if she could build out the attic into a bedroom. "It just needs insulation and sheetrock and a way to get up there, and I can do the rest," she assured us. "My room is too small for my sewing machine and fabric." "Papa doesn't have time," I replied sternly, which turned whiny as I listed my fix-it priorities, including painting the living room walls. "Well, then paint the walls instead of talking about it," Fiona interrupted. "We can do it. I know how. I'll help you pick a color." She stared me down. I wanted to stomp my feet and keep my attic storage space the way it was, but she was crying. a frustrated, sad cry that had outgrown her pink room. When Tom and she took on the attic, I kept my distance. I didn't have the skill set, and I didn't have invested interest. But Fiona was different. She had endurance. She knew every tool's name. She knew the window flange was important for waterproofing, and the ceiling vent would give proper airflow. I wondered why she didn't have as much interest when we studied industrialization that fall and read Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. When standing in her quiet attic bedroom, I remembered our winter walks together. Neither of us tired of repetition when outdoors. The smells of burning wood from chimneys, stark gray and pale blue lines of horizon and tree branches, washed up fish bones in the marsh. Sometimes we could see our breath in puffs of moisture. I thought of the walk when we saw an owl on the grounded docks just a few months ago in February. The walk was a break from finalizing her application for the RISD summer program. There were patches of snow on the ground that February day and dried up brown leaves along the road. It was our daily route through the neighborhood, past stone walls and across the train tracks to its end at a marina. In winter, the wooden docks were removed from the sea and scattered under trees out of the way of high tides and storms. Seeing an owl that day broke our routine. Its sleeping, statuesque pose and colors of tree bark worked as camouflage, and we only noticed it sitting on the dock post when we passed by it close enough to touch it. It was larger than we imagined an owl to be. As I watched Fiona snap a photo with her phone, the owl became increasingly superimposed from its background. We seemed to recede into the landscape as the shadows of tree branches textured the light on the dock and our skin. And then the bird eyes opened and saw us. I expected the owl to lift off in a flurry of disruption, but it didn't blink or budge. Since then, I have learned owl facts, like a group of them is called a parliament, and that their blinking eyelid is separate from the sleeping eyelid. Fiona and I backed up and said something like "wow" before the owl's lower lid slid up over its eyes again. This close encounter felt significant. Maybe it was seeing its eyes see us. Maybe it was the feeling that our temporary worries were unimportant in the scheme of nature's heavy weight of winter survival. Maybe it was the sudden shifting perspective of seeing camouflage come into focus. We walked on in silence. I knew we would go home and Fiona would focus on her application, and summer would come and she would go away for the first time, just like she'd built out the attic and moved out of her childhood room.
Thank you, Mirren. Our next reader is Gregory Petty. And I may have mispronounced your last name. Apologies if I did.
It's either Pettis or Petties. I don't know. It was misspelled actually when I was born, so it's kind of. My mother just left it that way. So anyway, this story I originally worked on in Ethan's class, and then I subsequently a longer version of it was published in Boating World magazine. Pardon me. A little nervous, but I write for a lot of local magazines, and I want to encourage all the writers in the Memoir Project that if I can learn to write, believe me, anybody can. So with that, this is a story about some memories of growing up on an island. It's called Sandworms and Ice Cream. I was eating my ice cream as fast as I could, but the hot sun was melting the large scoop of chocolate faster than I could eat it. My teeth were freezing as drops of melted cream dripped down my arm into the hot sand. When the last bite was gone, I'd run down the beach, jump in the water, and wash off the evidence of my gluttony. Just another summer day at the beach for my brother and I. East Beach on Bell Island in Rowayton, Connecticut, is where my younger brother and I grew up. We were raised by my grandfather, George Stewart Hopkins. We called him Gran. Gran was a tall Jimmy Stewart look-alike who'd worked in the family newspaper business in New York City for many years. He was also an avid sportsman and took us hunting and fishing all over New England. Gran's house was a large, rambling, three-story structure built in 1894 by the Fosters. The Fosters were one of the first families to settle on Bell Island and being frugal Yankees, they'd built the house out of scrap lumber. The house had settled over the last 100 years, and there wasn't a straight line to be found. During nor'easters, the house would rock like a boat, and my room on the 3rd floor was where the motion was the worst. Growing up on Belle Island meant our lives were governed by the tides. High tide was for swimming, and low tide was for clamming or digging for sandworms. The sandworms were used for bait, and we could sell them to the fishermen. The sandworms had green bodies with seemingly thousands of wiggly red legs. These Jurassic-looking creatures had big black retractable pinchers on their heads and were fascinating to us. Taking a fish hook and impaling the squirming worm on it as he tried to bite you was a rite of passage that still gives me a shiver when I think about it today. Grant's boat was a 16-foot flat-bottomed dory that he'd bought secondhand from Hickory Bluff. Hickory Bluff was a small bait and tackle shop that rented moorings and small boats to fishermen. Included with the boat was an old Johnson 5-horsepower outboard, a set of oars, an anchor, and a few square seat cushions that also doubled as life preservers. I was about 5 years old the first time Grant took me out fishing in the dory. We were trolling for stripers on the far side of Sheffield Island, the largest of the Norfolk Islands. I'll never forget the first time a fish struck my lure. It was like an electric shock. The power of the fish bent the rod in an arc that vibrated as the line swished through the water. My small arms ached from the struggle, but I held on and finally landed a fine 5-pound striper. I've been so engaged with fishing, I didn't notice that the weather had changed. Dark clouds now blocked out the sun, and a strong wind blew in. We pulled in our lines and headed for home. The tide turned against the wind, rapidly creating large breaking waves in a tide rip. I was anxious, but Grant sat steady as a rock, calmly steering the outboard against the seas. The waves seemed gigantic to me, but looking back on it now, some 60 years later, the waves might have been 5 feet. I gained confidence as the dory's bow rose to every crest, although whitecaps were all around. We shipped only a little spray. After rounding the island, the seas went down, and an hour later we were back home at the beach. I proudly carried the fish up to the house, laying the fish out on newspaper. Grant taught me how to clean it. Later, the large white fillets, basted with butter and lemon, tasted great. Those faraway days now seem like a soft dream, but I can still feel the rise and fall of the tides in my soul. I can remember the sticky ice cream on my fingers and see the worms wiggling on the hook. I can feel the warm salt water drying on my skin and see the grizzled face of my grandfather with a sly smile and a twinkle in his eye. Thanks.
So, some of you have probably heard some of this before. This is something that I've been toying around with for a while, and I envision it as maybe a little bit longer than this at some point. I just haven't had the chance to finish it, but I thought that maybe doing this would encourage me to do that. So, and this is about my sister, Dinah. She's a scrawny little thing, my sister Dinah. She looks nothing like the bright-eyed, burbling, chubby-cheeked babies whose images adorned boxes of Ivory Snow detergent and jars of Gerber baby food back in her time, in the 1950s. Dinah is unsmiling, even grimacing, and has the ghastly pallor of an infant who has never been outdoors. She is swaddled in white, so you can't see the contours of her tiny body. I come across the picture unexpectedly while I am sorting and packing in preparation for a move. I have seen the grainy photo many times before, but it is always unsettling. This is my sister, born just a year after me. I don't remember her, of course, but I always knew that I had a sister. Had a sister, not have. My mother had already lost a baby a year before I was born, a boy, who died at birth of a heart defect. They never named him. Then there was me, full term and healthy and called Susan for the first 3 weeks of my life, until my parents decided my name was too Essie, so they changed it to Deborah. I vividly recall all the details of my birth, a story told to me so frequently that I can replay it in my head like a television rerun. I arrived at a teaching hospital in New York, my entrance witnessed by several medical students, I was told, because it was normal and uneventful. I slide out on my back, gazing upward as a dozen faces peered down at me intently. And then Dinah was born. My parents never talked much about the children that they lost, 4 altogether. Maybe people didn't do that back in the 50s. You got pregnant, and if it didn't work out, you tried again, hoping for a better outcome. After my older brother and Dinah, there were twin boys, also unnamed, who died at birth. Then, a year later, my brother Tom, who was extremely premature but somehow held on. And so we were 4, a mom, a dad, a girl, and a boy, like a family on TV. As I look at Dinah's picture, I think about the randomness of life. Some babies are planned for, others show up unexpectedly, some die. I've lost a few babies along the way, and for many years felt those losses as punishment for being bad in some way. I got pregnant when I didn't mean to. Then I couldn't when it was all that I could think about. Then, somewhat improbably, I had 2 boys, the children I believe now I was meant to have. Buried somewhere in my boxes of photos is a picture of my own daughter, born just shy of 24 weeks gestation. Like Dinah, she is not pink or round or cuddly. Her eyes are screwed shut, and she looks pained, lips pursed, her tiny arms folded across her chest. She weighed just over a pound. We were going to name her Catherine after my mother, who died when I was 16. But we chose to name her after me instead, saving the name for another daughter who never came. I got pregnant again a year after losing Deborah. And this time there was no uncertainty, no drama, unless you count the car ride down the mountain from our house to the hospital in full-blown hard labor. Since this was my first full-term pregnancy, the hospital staff seemed to discount the urgency of my situation, asking me to fill out some insurance papers. I can't do that right now. Trying to seat me in a wheelchair. I can't sit. I can't even walk. And then, eyes rolling, telling me to please remove my clothes and put on this gown and hop up on the examination table. A nurse said, "Let's take a look." Then, surprised, "Oh, it looks like you're going to have a baby right now." We thought we were better prepared for our second child. My husband and I made several test runs to determine the fastest route from our house to the hospital. I asked a friend to rehearse going to the hospital with me in case I went into labor at work. We made arrangements to drop our son John off at a neighbor's house when the time came. The time came in the middle of the night, 2 weeks before my due date. But I had already packed a bag, just in case. We yanked John out of bed and practically threw him onto our neighbor's doorstep before tearing off to the hospital. This one turned out to be in even more of a hurry than John was. And while we were still on the highway, the baby's head was crowning. "Should I pull over?" my husband wailed. "No," I screamed, "keep going." We careened into the hospital parking lot, and my husband sprinted to the emergency entrance and announced, "My wife's having a baby, right now." I was practically standing in the front seat of the car with the baby's head poking out of me when somebody yanked the door open and caught the baby before it dropped on the floor. The rest was a bit of a blur. Someone wrapped the baby and asked my husband if he wanted to cut the umbilical cord before whisking the infant away. As they tended to me in the car, I turned to my husband. "Is it a boy or a girl?" He looked stricken. "I forgot to look." There was more. Just days after being discharged, James had to go back into the hospital to be treated for jaundice. And John, who was 5, became seriously ill when his brother was only 2 weeks old and was also hospitalized, but they both recovered. After putting Dinah's picture back in the box, I pick up another, this one a photo of the 4 of us, a mom, a dad, and 2 boys, like a family on TV. And just a small postscript, my husband Bob died about 4 years ago. James is 26 now and the father of a beautiful little girl named Ella, and my son John is getting married this weekend. So life goes on.
Thank you in advance. My name's Tom Morton. I'm grateful for the 2 classes that I've taken with Ethan and for the opportunity that this has afforded me here. How I learned. My odd-numbered primary school years were all taught by nuns. I'd like to think there was design in that. In 1st grade, after an unexpectedly rocky start in public school kindergarten, Sister Rosemary sat behind the teacher's desk on my entrance to parochial school, all of us in our costume. She taught letters and words, numbers, addition. I learned something else too, how to lie. That I learned on my own very early in the school year. Sister Rosemary taught lots of things, but her lesson on lying didn't come until the day before summer. Sister started our first week with letters printed on perforated manila folder type paper. Under fierce religious control, we were permitted to tear the letters, row by folded over row, fold and separate. Multiple copies of each letter were needed. Then folding, ripping, some more, building alphabet collections to last the year. We began writing immediately, typesetting our names and the schools on our desktops. Sister pinballed from desk to desk, dispensing prim guidance. It couldn't have been more difficult than our names, perhaps something simpler. I knew I didn't have to bother completing the task, but I can't say how, so I didn't. While I swirled the letters around the wooden desktop, Sister visited my area eventually. There may have been a sort of smile as she told me I could return my letters to the box. As far as she was concerned, I'd completed my letter arrangements. She conveyed her sense that I already knew just how to do what she'd asked. I did not disabuse her of that understanding. I was reading before Labor Day that year, certainly, but still, lie of omission. I didn't do the assignment, but let her believe that I had. I felt no guilt as I already knew how to spell and to sin. I was a front row kid with 3 siblings at Assumption. Sister assumed much. I did learn deceit, though I may have misplaced the I and E trying to spell it. Sister Rosemary's lie, at least the first one I identified, came during our last week at grade 1. Several parents hovered, mysterious and silent, in our classroom that hot June day. We played a game very new to us prospective 2nd graders, a once-only entertainment. With some fanfare, crepe paper glued to a brown box style, Sister announced her need for some help in her classroom for the next school year. The paper slip she pulled from a small box contained the names of 2 students who'd help Sister in the fall, or at least there were many slips of paper, but only 2 names, a box, and 1 big lie. The parents maneuvered the winners out of the room quietly, immediately. Lisa, one of the 2, had only a mother there. I found Lisa again in high school. I hadn't seen her since she'd won her prize that afternoon some 10 years earlier. Lisa was again in the same year as I, so the holding back hadn't helped. We never spoke or even met eyes in the 3 years of high school. She did not join me in graduating. The confusion created by these special prizes and parents, the excitement and strangeness of it, wasn't something we could question. We didn't anyway, and some even complained, wanting to be teachers' helpers too. At home, my mother explained something about these anomalies, the no-father family, for instance, and about the girls, how they were smart, but only smart enough to have to take 1st grade twice. Mom let me in on the lie. I remember Lisa's name because of the special role she played in teaching another crucial first grade lesson. There was a toilet in our classroom and a small windowless room at the back. We were children after all, but pupils were to raise their hands and ask to go. Lisa blithely failed to live up to first grade expectations. She broke the rules doubly even. She had not raised her hand to discuss the urine running down her leg. Who knows how long the puddle under Lisa's chair was there, calmly radiating out onto dismal gray tiles. Seconds, minutes, but not hours. Rosemary was attentive. I don't think even a moment passed between the nun's understanding of the situation and her vocal condemnation of it. Sister spat words at Lisa in the interim between the religious one's first step toward the girl and the moment both of them, complexly connected, disappeared behind the bathroom door. From the pebble glass in the door's top half came only Lisa's wordless, muffled sobs and the much louder, sing-songy reproach flowing from Sister. The door jerked open, and a mop bucket preceded them out of the bathroom, Rosemary steering with her right hand on the mop's handle, left hand buried somewhere near the neck in Lisa's hair and clothes. Everything landed at the girl's desk. I don't know that desks and chairs near the puddle scraped away, even unconsciously, under the power of the students whose desks bordered the "you can smell it too" problem. It's understandable if they did. It's just reflexive. Again, mercifully again, the details of the mopping, squeezing, sounds of drops on galvanized metal are not part of it in my mind. I have a tendency to dissociate. They resounded, though, those drops, for Lisa and all of us. Lisa certainly would have finished the job, and there's the lesson in it, at least for me. Sees things through and avoid any and all eliminative functions when at Assumption School. The troubling consequences of this lesson manifested for me in Sister Catherine's grade 3 classroom. A doctor's visit was required that time. And even with Sister Rosemary, my resolve shattered. By mid-year, I was hiding in closets ahead of the morning bus because I couldn't do the problems in the last chapters of the mathematics book. I'd read ahead. We were just kids after all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Rosalie Maxim.
Well, I took Ethan's class for the first time this summer and really loved it. And
Step right up to the microphone.
okay, and I grew up in Westerly in the 1950s and spent a lot of time at the United Theater. So, of course, I had a passion for movie stars. And our mind is a junkyard. We forget so many things, but we all have a certain memory or memories of things that we keep, and this is about one of them, and it's called The Movie Star. When I was 8, I had a movie star collection. It was a scrapbook with colored pictures of stars paper-clipped to their personal pages. It was 1953, and money was tight, but I saved my quarter allowances to purchase photoplay or motion picture magazines. Every issue featured 3 or 4 color pinups, which I would cut out and fasten onto the appropriate pages. In one magazine, I found an address to request a free handwritten letter from Elizabeth Taylor. When the letter arrived, it included a very small card on which were printed the words, "Official Movie Star." It was impressive, so I put it in my jumper pocket and took it to school. My 3rd grade teacher that year, a stern, unsmiling redhead, tolerated very little talking or spontaneity. I sat in the back of the classroom beside my best friend, Mary Lou Dipolino. On the day in question, when Mrs. Samataro had her back to us, filling the board with chalk dust and multiplication problems, I decided to flash my official movie star card to Mary Lou. Nearsighted, she squinted to get a better look. "What does that mean?" she whispered. I pointed to the card and then to myself, careful not to draw the attention of Mrs. Samataro, who was looking at her lesson book and then back to the board. Mary Lou's eyes widened and she hissed, "Are you really a movie star?" What 8-year-old could resist that temptation? I vigorously nodded my head up and down and silently mouthed, "Yes." She gestured for me to pass her the card, but I held it just a little bit closer to her. She gawked at the words, her jaw dropping in awe and admiration. Mrs. Semitaro, none the wiser, called Charles Brooks to the board to work the first problem. Mary Lou excitedly tapped the shoulder of Claudia Dinoli, who sat in front of her. When Claudia turned around, she whispered, "Rosalie is an official movie star." Now, Claudia was no dummy, not to imply that Mary Lou was, but we were only 8, and Claudia had more street smarts than most of us. The youngest of 4, her siblings had taught her a thing or two. She furrowed her brow and sneered, "You are not." Now, I should have put an end to the ruse then and there, but I was in it for the long term, and on some level, I was starting to believe it. Besides, if the card convinced Mary Lou, might it not have the same stupefying effect on Claudia? I pointed to the card, then to me, once again, vigorously nodding in the affirmative. Meanwhile, at the board, Charlie Brooks was having a devil of a time with a multiplication problem, so most were focused on his discomfort. It was then that Claudia decided to put an abrupt end to my Hollywood career. She raised her hand, whispering to me, "I know you are not, and I'm going to ask the teacher." I was overcome with panic, having never considered this consequence. "No, no," I pleaded. "I was just kidding. I am not. No, please don't ask her." Vindictive little Claudia was on a spite mission. Mrs. Semitaro was now looking back to our corner, sensing we were clearly not focusing on Charlie's attempts to master math. "What is it, Claudia?" she asked, irritated. "Mrs. Semitaro," the little witch blurted. "Rosalie LaPetra says she's a movie star. I don't believe her. Is she?" If I could have jumped out the window, I would have. But my distance from it and our third-floor location rendered that impossible. Instead, I slouched into my seat as far as I could and looked down, pretending to tie my shoes. By then, all eyes were upon me, even those of Charlie, relieved that the attention had been drawn away from his limited multiplication skills. It seemed that hours passed before Mrs. Semitaro rendered her verdict. "Well," she responded, "I don't think that she is now, but she may very well be one someday." Thanks to her diplomatic response, the class moved on to the lessons of the day, and my lie was forgotten. I, however, have never forgotten her kind gesture, and I followed her compassionate example when I became a teacher. When I got home that afternoon, I tucked my official movie star card away in a dresser drawer, but I clung to the dream for quite a while, fantasizing about a time when my image might be paperclipped to my page in someone's scrapbook.
Thank you again to all our Westerly Memoir Project students and readers. And as a special treat tonight, we have a guest, our local memoirist, Lang Martine. He is a member of the Nashville Country Music Writers Hall of Fame. He is our beloved friend and longtime Watch Hill resident, and his memoir, Permission to Fly, came out this spring. And we're delighted that he's joining us to read 5 minutes as well. So come on up, Lang. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanne. Jeanne, you are not only a fabulous writer, but you are a most giving and most inclusive human being. Thank you very much. In July of the year I was 11 years old, family 2 houses away from us invited me to go boating around New England on a yacht cruise. This family owned a well-known and large shipbuilding yard. So boating around New England with people who actually built boats sounded good to me. So I went. Oops, sorry. In the summer of 1953, the looters sailed me for the first time into the harborside village where I sit writing this now in the summer of 2016. Bill Looters, my friend's dad, was a fabled racer, designer, builder of sailboats, including 1962 America's Cup winner Weatherly. The Looters were athletes. They played tennis, they skied, they sailed, aces at all. But at sailing, they were famous. At the time, they drew me on board their yacht, the You'll Do, and made me one of them. They raced a stunning black sloop named Storm. Storm was a stripped-down, all-business racing craft with nothing visible below deck but highly varnished wooden ribs and a few orange life preservers. The sails, the hull, the skill of the sailors were all that mattered. The You'll Do was Storm's tender, a comfortable 50-foot motor yacht made for sleeping, eating, travel, and cocktails. You'll Do accompanied Storm on the New England sailboat racing circuit. The You'll Do was gray and plain, nice but not fancy. If I were to show you a picture of the You'll Do, you would not swoon. But when I woke up my first morning on board and heard its engine murmuring beneath me, felt its steady vibrations, pulled on my shorts and socks and walked 4 polished steps up to the sunny open-aired saloon, found Captain Harry alone in his dress khakis, guiding the You'll Do into the harbor of Watch Hill, Rhode Island, I was in love with the You'll Do for life. And though I had no way knowing then just how deeply this coastal village of Watch Hill would affect my life, I was about to fall in love with it, too, before I even knew its name. Set beside an ancient harbor, horseshoe-shaped and backed up against a hill that runs down the other side to the Atlantic Ocean, Watch Hill has been a refuge for those seeking relief from the summer's heat since the time of the Niantic Indians in the 1600s. Modern folks who study such things say that Watch Hill has its own microclimate. That must be true, because I've gone there now every summer since 1964 and never wished I had air conditioning. Not when I can have real air blowing across my pillow from out off the cool Atlantic, or off Long Island Sound's gentle whitecaps. Not when through my wide open windows I can hear the waves pounding the beach at night, the clanging of the buoys at sea, or the lonesome squawk of seagulls in the morning. But that first day, my entry into the most glorious harbor in the world had nothing to do with a search for cool weather. No, mine was strictly the luck of the draw, the luck of having the Looters for neighbors. At the mouth of Watch Hill Harbor is a stone wall built out into the channel, a breakwater to keep surf from disturbing the boats moored beyond. Looking out over the bow of the You'll Do, I watched as the breakwater came closer and closer until it passed off to our right. And then Captain Harry turned the big wooden tiller to the left, and I looked. Suddenly, a new world opened. Before my eyes was a stunning garden of white masts. Behind them, the white faces of shops hugged the water's edge. A tiny yacht club on pilings sat out in the water with colorful pennants strung across its roofline, flower boxes at each window holding red geraniums that tumbled out over their fronts. A blizzard of white-trimmed, shingled summer houses looked out over the harbor and sprinkled down the hillside to the shoreline. "Where are we, Captain Harry?" "Watch Hill," he said. Wow. Pretty good sight, huh? I looked everywhere at once. I love it. Yeah, he said, that seems to happen to everybody. I could not even guess that my lifelong love affair with Watch Hill had just begun.
What a perfect way to end. That was great, right on topic. So I think that pretty much wraps things up. Just a couple reminders / plugs. Please support your local bookstore. I recommend 2 books that are for sale and on display by the cash register by Jeanne and Lang, which you might want to pick up on your way out. Is the store open for a little bit longer, or what is the... Till 9. Okay, great. So you can hang out and mill about and purchase more foods and beverages and just sort of socialize with each other. The sign-up sheet for the mailing list, if you haven't signed up and you want to get... my lovely assistant Greg is holding that up, is available if you want to make sure you're on the mailing list to find out about future classes as part of the Westerly Memoir Project. We'll hopefully do another event just like this sometime next year, TBA, you know. And again, thank you all for being here, and another round of applause for all of our readers. And hope to see you here next time or see you in the classroom, and thanks for being here. Have a good night.